Jack stood behind the counter of the gas station, absently flipping through a magazine. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead provided a monotonous soundtrack to his quiet life. Out the window, the empty road stretched into the distance, framed by a clear blue sky. The town was still. Quiet. Just how Jack liked it. Each day was the same for Jack. He rose early, brewed coffee, and drove the 5 minutes to the station. He'd mop the floors, stock the shelves, and wait for the occasional traveler. It was a routine that kept him grounded, away from his past. He preferred the isolation, the slow days where nothing unexpected ever happened. Jack wasn't from this town, but he'd lived here long enough for people to stop asking where he came from. His story was simple, a guy who kept to himself, who found solace in the quiet. Nobody needed to know more than that. The regulars who stopped by rarely bothered him with small talk. They'd nod, hand over cash, and be on their way. It was a system that worked. His life was carefully constructed, like a fragile house of cards. One strong gust, one misstep, and the whole thing could come crashing down. He couldn't afford that. Not after everything. The memories of his old life, the one filled with chaos, violence, and regret, were locked away, never to be revisited. Jack leaned against the counter, lost in thought, when the distant growl of an engine caught his attention. He straightened up, scanning the horizon. A car appeared in the distance, shimmering in the heat as it approached. As it got closer, he could make out the shape of a classic car, a pristine, polished relic from the past, the kind you didn't see often around here. The car rolled to a stop in front of the station. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped out. She moved slowly, but there was a deliberate grace in her movements. Jack couldn't help but notice her age. She was well into her 70s, maybe older. But there was something about her that seemed timeless, as if she had seen more of the world than most. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, the kind you'd expect to see on a Hollywood starlet from decades ago. Her clothes were simple but elegant, slacks and a blouse, with a scarf draped loosely around her neck. She glanced around the station, her eyes finally settling on Jack. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Afternoon," she said, her voice soft but commanding. Jack nodded in return, stepping out from behind the counter. "Afternoon. Fill her up?" She handed him a 20 without answering, her gaze lingering on the distant mountains. Jack slid the bill into his pocket and walked around the car to the pump. The tank was nearly empty. As the gas flowed into the tank, Jack stole glances at the woman. There was something about her, something that didn't quite fit the picture of an old woman passing through town. Her presence felt out of place, but not in a way that he could pinpoint. Maybe it was the way she held herself, like she had a secret she wasn't sharing. "Nice car," he said, more out of obligation than genuine interest. "Thank you," she replied, her tone distant. She seemed preoccupied, as if her mind was elsewhere. "It's been with me a long time." Jack nodded, his gaze falling to her wrist as she adjusted her scarf. That's when he saw it. A tattoo, faint but clear enough to catch his attention. It was a series of numbers, inked in thin, black lines. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the tattoo itself that bothered him, it was what it meant. He froze, his hands still gripping the nozzle. Those numbers. He recognized them. It was a code, one he hadn't seen in years. A code used by a criminal organization he had once been tangled with, back in the days when his life was a whirlwind of danger and deceit. Seeing it now, here on this woman's wrist, was like a punch to the gut. Margaret noticed his pause and followed his gaze to her wrist. She smiled, a small, almost apologetic smile. "Ah, this old thing?" she said, raising her arm slightly. "Got it when I was young. Doesn't mean anything now." But Jack wasn't convinced. He couldn't be. That code, it wasn't something you just walked away from. Not easily. He finished pumping the gas, his mind racing, trying to piece together what this could mean. Who was this woman? And why was she here? Margaret took the keys from her pocket, ready to get back in her car, but she hesitated for a moment, turning back to Jack. Her eyes locked with his, and for a brief moment, it felt like she was searching for something in his expression, something unspoken. "Thank you, Jack," she said softly. Jack's chest tightened. He hadn't told her his name. Before he could respond, she was already in the car, the engine purring to life. He watched as she drove off, her taillights disappearing into the horizon, leaving behind nothing but questions and a faint smell of gasoline. Jack stood there for a long moment, the $20 still in his pocket, the echoes of his old life swirling around him like a storm. Margaret had stirred something in him, something he'd tried to bury for years. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet life was about to be turned upside down. As the day crept into evening, Jack locked up the station, his mind still on the numbers. He walked the short distance to his small apartment above the local diner, his footsteps heavy with unease. Margaret's face, her voice, that tattoo, it all replayed in his mind, over and over. He entered his apartment and stood by the window, looking out over the quiet town. The mountains in the distance loomed like silent guardians, but tonight they offered no comfort. Jack ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts drifting back to the organization he had once been part of. The code. The people it belonged to. The things he'd done. He had spent years trying to forget, to build a new life far away from the chaos. But now, with one glance at that tattoo, everything he had worked so hard to escape was creeping back in. He could feel it, like a shadow in the corner of his mind. Jack sat down on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. He knew he couldn't ignore this. He needed answers. Who was Margaret, really? And what did her presence in this quiet town mean for him? The peaceful life he had crafted for himself was starting to unravel. And Jack had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. Jack sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. His mind kept drifting back to Margaret's tattoo. The numbers haunted him, pulling him back into memories he had fought for years to forget. He never wanted to think about those days again, the organization, the violence, the constant fear. But now, it was all coming back. Late nights in dimly lit rooms. Cold, calculated conversations with men who had no soul left. Jack had been young, desperate, and reckless when he got involved. The organization had promised power, money, and a way out of the life he'd been struggling through. But the cost had been higher than he ever anticipated. The tattoo on Margaret's wrist was a stark reminder of those dark days, when loyalty was earned through blood, and leaving wasn't an option. The numbers, once seen, could never be unseen. In the organization, the tattoo wasn't just ink. It was a mark of allegiance. Each number represented something, a rank, a role, a job completed. Only the key players had it, the ones who had proven their worth in ways Jack wished he hadn't. He never got the tattoo himself. He wasn't in long enough. He had bailed, and fast. Too fast for them to track him down, at least that's what he'd hoped. Jack's mind raced through the possibilities. Was Margaret involved in the organization? Was she a messenger? Or worse, had they sent her for him? His paranoia grew, the old fear gnawing at him. There were so many questions and no answers. He felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing down, like the time he left it all behind and didn't look back. The people he'd hurt, the things he'd done, they were all starting to resurface, and with them came the fear of being dragged back into that world. Days passed, but Jack couldn't shake the thought of Margaret. His quiet life began to fray at the edges. She had become an obsession, a puzzle he needed to solve. He tried to push the thoughts away, to keep his routine, but the tattoo was always there, lingering in his mind. It was a link to a past he thought he'd escaped, and the more he dwelled on it, the more he felt pulled back. One night, unable to sleep, Jack found himself at his desk, surrounded by old files he swore he'd never look at again. Pages of scribbled notes, phone numbers, and contacts from his time with the organization. He knew better than to open those doors again, but he couldn't stop. He was desperate for answers. Who was Margaret? What was her connection to the group? He went through everything he could find, but there was nothing on her. No name, no face, no history that he could connect to that tattoo. He started making calls, keeping his voice low, asking around under the guise of curiosity. He had to keep it quiet, careful not to stir up attention. He called people he hadn't spoken to in years, old contacts, shady figures who were still deep in the life Jack had left. The conversations were short, clipped, and filled with tension. They knew better than to ask questions, and Jack gave them as little as possible. But none of them had heard anything. No mention of an old woman, no whispers of someone looking for Jack. Frustration mounted as the days dragged on. He felt like he was chasing a ghost. And yet something inside him couldn't let it go. Jack found himself driving past Margaret's house late at night, parked a few blocks away, watching. She lived alone, a small, unremarkable home tucked into the corner of town. From the outside, everything seemed normal. She came and went like any other elderly woman, groceries in hand, keeping her yard tidy. But Jack knew better. He'd seen the tattoo. He knew there had to be more to her story. One afternoon, Jack spotted her at the local diner, sitting by herself with a cup of tea and a book. He watched her through the window, trying to piece together who she really was. She didn't fit the profile of someone involved in a criminal organization, but then again, neither did most of the people he had known in that world. The best players were always the ones you'd least expect. Margaret's quiet demeanor and graceful presence could be a perfect cover. The more Jack observed, the more things didn't add up. Little details started to stand out. Margaret's house was almost too perfect, no clutter, no signs of personal life beyond the essentials. Her car, though old, was immaculate, always shining as if it had just been detailed. And then there were her interactions. Jack noticed she had no real friends, no close relationships. She moved through the town like a shadow, polite but distant, as if she were only passing through. Jack's gut told him she was hiding something. He began to notice other things, too. She would occasionally disappear for hours, only to return late at night. And there were times when Jack could swear she was watching him, her eyes flickering his way in the briefest of glances. Was she onto him? Was she playing a game of cat and mouse, waiting for him to make the wrong move? One evening, Jack found something that made his blood run cold. He had been looking through old photos of known members of the organization when he stumbled upon a grainy black and white picture from years ago. It was from a meeting, a rare gathering of the higher-ups. In the background, barely noticeable, was a younger woman with the same poised elegance as Margaret. The same eyes, the same demeanor. Her face was turned slightly, but Jack was sure it was her. Suddenly, everything clicked. Margaret wasn't just involved. She had been part of the inner circle. A key figure, hidden in plain sight all these years. Jack's mind raced. Had she recognized him from the start? Was she here because of him? The paranoia began to eat away at Jack. He started sleeping less, watching Margaret more. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for the right moment to strike. The quiet town felt more dangerous by the day, the stillness no longer a comfort but a threat. Jack's obsession was growing, consuming him, as the lines between past and present blurred. But no matter how much he watched, no matter how many questions he asked, the truth remained just out of reach. Jack couldn't take it anymore. The questions had built up, and the paranoia was suffocating. He had watched Margaret long enough, pieced together enough clues, and his suspicions had grown too large to ignore. That evening, just before closing the gas station, he saw her car pull up again. This time, he wouldn't let her leave without answers. The low hum of the engine faded as Margaret parked in her usual spot. Jack's pulse quickened. He stepped outside, his mind racing. She got out of the car, calm and collected, her usual unreadable expression on her face. But Jack wasn't here for small talk. "Who are you really?" His voice came out sharper than he intended. Margaret raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden confrontation. "Excuse me?" she asked, her tone neutral, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes, recognition maybe. Jack wasn't sure, but he pressed on. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. The tattoo, the way you've been acting, it's all connected to something from my past. And I need to know why you're here." Margaret hesitated for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. She glanced around, making sure no one else was nearby. Her eyes settled back on Jack, this time with a different intensity. You were part of it, weren't you? She said quietly. You were in the organization. Jack stiffened, his heart pounding. He didn't deny it. That was a long time ago. I got out. Margaret's gaze softened, but only slightly. No one ever really gets out, Jack. The sound of his name coming from her mouth made his stomach twist. She wasn't supposed to know that. Margaret seemed to read his unease and took a step closer, her voice lowering. I didn't come here looking for you, Jack. I came here because my past is catching up to me. But it seems we're tangled in the same web. Jack was silent for a moment, his mind whirling. He had expected resistance, denials, lies. But there was something about the way Margaret was speaking now, calm, direct, as if she'd been carrying this secret for years. The tattoo, Jack began, his voice quieter now. It's not just an old mark, is it? Margaret's lips tightened into a thin line. She held out her wrist, the faded numbers barely visible in the dim evening light. This, she said, is the reason I can never truly escape. It's a symbol, yes, but not the way you think. It's not just from the criminal world. It's from a time when I worked for the government. Jack blinked, caught off guard. The government? Margaret nodded, her eyes growing distant. A covert task force. We were sent to infiltrate and dismantle criminal organizations, yours included. My job was to blend in, earn their trust, gather intelligence, and when the time was right, take them down. Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't know what to believe, but the pieces were starting to fit together. So you were undercover? Yes, Margaret replied. I was embedded for years, working deep within their ranks. The tattoo, it was part of the identity I had to adopt. It was a key identifier, a way to mark those who were trusted with sensitive information. Only the higher-ups had it. Jack took a step back, processing what she was telling him. You helped bring them down. Margaret nodded. We took down some of the biggest players, but not all of them. Some slipped through the cracks, and they've been looking for revenge ever since. That's why I'm here, Jack. They've found me. Jack felt the weight of her words. The same people who had hunted his past were still out there, still looking for their enemies. And Margaret, this old woman who had seemed so harmless, was right in the middle of it all. They know who you are, Jack said slowly. And now they'll come after you. They already are, Margaret replied quietly. That's why I've been moving from place to place, trying to stay off their radar. But it's getting harder. They have resources, connections. They're closing in. Jack's mind raced. If what Margaret was saying was true, it meant the danger was real, and not just for her. If these people knew she was here, it wouldn't be long before they realized Jack was nearby, too. His past was too closely tied to hers. For a moment, Jack considered walking away, letting Margaret handle her own problems. But he couldn't. Not now. If they were after her, they'd eventually find him, too. And maybe, just maybe, he could get answers along the way. He still didn't trust Margaret completely, but she was his only lead to understanding what was really happening. I can help you, Jack said, surprising even himself. But I need to know everything. Margaret studied him for a moment before nodding. I'll tell you more as we go. But right now, we don't have time for the whole story. We need to move. They'll be coming soon. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He had spent years hiding, trying to build a quiet life away from the mess he left behind. Now, it was all unraveling in front of him. We'll leave town, Margaret continued. Go somewhere they won't expect. But I need your help. You know how these people operate. You can help me stay ahead of them. Jack hesitated. This wasn't what he had planned for his life. He had been so careful to stay out of trouble, to keep his head down. But Margaret's story was dragging him back into a world he thought he'd left behind. Still, he couldn't deny the pull of his old instincts, the need to survive, to outsmart the people chasing them. All right, Jack said finally. We'll work together. But you need to be straight with me from now on. Margaret nodded. I will. We'll be safer together. As they made their plans, Jack couldn't help but feel the tension in the air. This uneasy alliance was fragile, built on half-truths and mutual necessity. He didn't fully trust Margaret, and he knew she didn't trust him either. But for now, they were in this together. Jack gathered his things quickly, keeping an eye on the horizon. Margaret moved with surprising efficiency for her age, packing only what was necessary. There was no time for second thoughts, no time to turn back. As they drove away from the gas station, leaving the quiet town behind, Jack glanced over at Margaret. Her face was set in determination, but there was something else, something vulnerable beneath the surface. She had been running for a long time, just like him. And now, their paths had crossed at the worst possible moment. Jack wasn't sure what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: this alliance was only the beginning. Jack and Margaret left under the cover of darkness, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. They moved swiftly, packing Margaret's essentials into her car without a word. The air was thick with tension as they both kept glancing over their shoulders, half expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. Jack's pulse raced. Years of living quietly hadn't dulled his instincts. The feeling of being hunted was creeping back into his bones. Margaret, though calm, moved with a quiet urgency, as if she'd done this before. As they drove, the quiet hum of the engine was the only thing breaking the silence between them. Jack's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes constantly shifting between the road and the rearview mirror. He had chosen the route carefully, back roads, avoiding highways or any place that might have cameras. The farther they got from Margaret's house, the more Jack felt a knot forming in his gut. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Margaret sat quietly in the passenger seat, her face calm but alert. Jack stole a glance at her every now and then, wondering how much she was holding back. Despite their uneasy alliance, he knew there were layers to her story she hadn't yet revealed. As they neared their destination, a rundown motel on the edge of a forgotten highway, Jack couldn't help but feel that they were walking straight into danger. It was only a matter of time before someone found them. They checked in under fake names. The motel was old, with creaky floors and a flickering neon sign outside, casting an eerie glow through the curtains. Jack settled in, trying to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind was racing with possibilities, and his gut told him something was wrong. The night dragged on in silence, broken only by the occasional sound of a car passing by. Jack paced by the window, eyes constantly scanning the parking lot. Every flicker of movement made his muscles tense, as if the shadows themselves were watching. Meanwhile, miles away, the criminals from Jack's past were closing in. Word had spread, Margaret had been spotted in town, and it didn't take long for her past to catch up with her. The men hunting her weren't just after revenge. They wanted to erase her completely, to ensure the secrets she held would never surface again. They were the remnants of the organization Jack had once been part of, men who had crawled out from the wreckage after it had been dismantled. Ruthless, relentless, and with nothing left to lose, they saw Margaret as a loose end that needed to be tied off permanently. At the helm of this group was a man named Richter, a cold, calculating figure who had survived the fall of the organization by disappearing into the shadows. He had bided his time, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Now, with Margaret exposed, he saw his opportunity. Jack's name had also surfaced during the investigation, and that only fueled Richter's desire. Both of them had played a role in the downfall of his empire, and now he was coming to settle the score. Richter's men were already on the move, tracking Margaret's movements with precision. They weren't sloppy. They had learned from past mistakes. This time, they were coming with full force. Jack and Margaret were on borrowed time, and the criminals knew exactly how to play the long game. They had eyes and ears in places Jack couldn't imagine, contacts in law enforcement, informants in small towns, and a network that spanned years of criminal enterprise. As Jack kept watch over the darkened parking lot, he sensed a shift in the air. There was more to worry about than just the criminals. He had noticed subtle signs along the way, unmarked cars that seemed to linger too long, strange faces that felt out of place. It wasn't just the men from his past who were after Margaret. He began to suspect that the government, the very people who had once employed her, might also be tracking her movements. Margaret knew too much, and if the wrong people found out, she could be considered a liability. The deeper Jack thought about it, the more he began to question whether they could trust anyone at all. The government wasn't above silencing its own operatives if the risk was high enough. Maybe Margaret had outlived her usefulness. Jack had heard stories, rumors of agents being erased, either through quiet deals or more permanent means. What if Margaret was next on that list? And what if, by helping her, Jack had made himself a target too? He confronted her one night, unable to hold back the flood of doubt that had been building. "You haven't told me everything," Jack said, his voice low but tense. "I need to know what's really going on. It's not just the criminals, is it? The government, they're watching you too, aren't they?" Margaret's face didn't betray much emotion, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, behind her eyes. She hesitated for a moment before responding. "It's complicated," she finally said, her voice steady but quieter than usual. "Yes, I was part of a covert task force, and yes, I dismantled criminal networks. But when you live in the shadows as long as I have, you make enemies on all sides." Jack's stomach tightened. "So they want you gone, too?" "I don't know for sure," Margaret admitted. "But it's possible. There are things I know, things I've seen, that could be dangerous to certain people. I've stayed hidden for as long as I could, but now, well, now they might consider me a threat." Jack ran a hand through his hair, his mind reeling. They were being hunted from every direction. The criminals were closing in, and now, the possibility of government agents being involved added another layer of danger. He didn't know who to trust anymore, not even Margaret. But one thing was clear: if they were going to survive, they needed to stay 2 steps ahead of everyone, and that meant working together. "You think they'll come after both of us?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Margaret looked him in the eyes, her expression serious. "If they find us, yes. And when they do, they won't be giving us a second chance." Jack's jaw tightened. He had spent years trying to avoid getting dragged back into the life he'd left behind, but now it seemed like there was no escape. The shadows were closing in, and the past he had tried so hard to outrun had finally caught up to him. They had no choice now. Jack and Margaret were on the run, hunted by 2 forces with vastly different motives but equally deadly intent. The criminals wanted revenge. The government might want silence. And Jack was stuck in the middle, torn between mistrust and survival. Their options were running out, and every decision could be their last. Jack sat in the motel room, the low hum of the fan doing nothing to drown out the noise in his head. The silence between him and Margaret had become almost unbearable. His mind kept turning over the same question: could he trust her? Every part of him screamed that he couldn't, but walking away meant giving in to the chaos of his past, something he had fought to leave behind. The weight of it all pressed down on him, and for the first time in years, Jack felt unsure of his own instincts. His past haunted him, lurking in the shadows of every thought. The decisions he'd made when he was part of the criminal organization, how he got pulled in deeper than he'd ever intended. Those memories clawed at him now, making him question if he had ever really changed. The life he had tried so hard to bury kept resurfacing, triggered by Margaret's presence and the danger that followed her. Jack wondered if he was capable of protecting anyone, let alone himself, or if he was doomed to repeat the same mistakes, always drawn back into the same deadly cycle. The tattoo on Margaret's wrist had opened a door to his past, and with it came a flood of memories he had tried to suppress. He remembered the way the organization worked, how they manipulated people, how trust was always a weapon to be used against you. Jack had been a cog in their machine, and even though he had left, those gears kept turning without him. Could Margaret be any different? Was she truly an innocent player in all this, or was she keeping secrets that could cost him everything? Jack's trust issues ran deep. He knew it. But it wasn't just about Margaret anymore. It was about the person he was trying to be. Every day on the run with her was a reminder of the man he used to be, and the man he wasn't sure he could escape. The quiet moments were the worst, those times when they were alone, when the only thing left to confront was the doubt gnawing away inside him. He wondered if he was being played, if this was just another con, another manipulation. Or worse, if he was so far gone that he couldn't see a way out. Margaret, sensing his distance, finally spoke one night. They were holed up in yet another dingy motel room, both exhausted from days of evading threats either of them fully understood. She sat across from him, her posture unusually tense, as though she knew the moment was coming. "You want to know the truth," she said, breaking the silence that had stretched on too long. Jack didn't respond immediately, but he didn't need to. Margaret could see it in his eyes, the doubt, the mistrust. "I haven't told you everything," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "I've kept things from you because I wasn't sure how much you could handle. But if we're going to survive this, you need to know what really happened." Jack leaned forward, listening carefully, his expression hard. He had waited for this moment, but part of him wasn't sure he was ready for what she was about to reveal. Margaret began recounting her final mission, the one that had set everything in motion. She had been sent deep into a criminal network, far more dangerous than even Jack had realized. Her job was to infiltrate, gather intelligence, and dismantle the organization from the inside. The tattoo, she explained, was part of an intricate code, one that identified key players in the network. It wasn't just a mark of loyalty. It was a way of keeping track of the most valuable assets within the criminal underworld. As she spoke, Jack's mind raced. He had known the tattoo was significant, but not to this extent. Margaret had been right in the middle of a covert operation that had brought down some of the most powerful criminals in the world. And now, those same criminals were hunting her because they believed she still had information that could destroy them completely. The operation was supposed to end quietly, Margaret continued, her tone darkening. But something went wrong. A few key players slipped through the cracks, and they've been after me ever since. They think I know things I don't. They won't stop until I'm dead. Jack sat back, taking it all in. The weight of her story sank in, heavy and suffocating. He understood now why the criminals wanted her dead. But he also realized something else. There was a level of danger here that he hadn't fully grasped. Margaret was in far deeper than he had thought, and by staying with her, he was walking into the lion's den. But even as she spoke, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more. Margaret had been withholding information from the start, and while she had finally opened up, there were layers of her story that still felt untold. He couldn't help but wonder if she was holding back, if there was something she wasn't saying, something critical. The tension between them reached a boiling point one night when Jack couldn't keep his doubts to himself any longer. "You're still hiding something," he said, his voice low but intense. "I can feel it. There's more to this than what you've told me." Margaret met his gaze, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Jack thought she might deny it, but instead, she just sighed. "There are things I can't tell you," she said. "Not yet. It's not that I don't trust you, Jack. It's that if you knew everything, it would put you in even more danger than you're already in." Jack stood, pacing the room, frustration mounting. He had been through too much, risked too much, to be kept in the dark. But at the same time, he couldn't deny that Margaret had a point. Every secret she revealed seemed to pull them deeper into the mess, and the more he knew, the more likely it was that they'd both end up dead. His mind was a battlefield, torn between the instinct to run and the sense of responsibility that kept him by her side. Jack had never been good at walking away from a fight, but this felt different. This was more than just survival, it was about redemption. Every time he thought about leaving, he wondered if this was his chance to make things right, to prove that he wasn't the same man who had once walked in the shadows. In the end, Jack made his choice. He couldn't leave her, not yet. Despite the lies, the half-truths, and the secrets, he felt that protecting Margaret was his only shot at redemption. Maybe he didn't trust her completely, but in some twisted way, they needed each other. "I'm staying," Jack said, his voice firm. "But if we're going to make it through this, you need to be straight with me. No more lies. No more half-truths. Margaret nodded, her expression softening. I'll tell you everything when the time is right. But for now, trust that I'm on your side, Jack. Jack didn't respond. He wasn't sure if he could ever fully trust her, but for now, he would stay. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: leaving her behind wasn't an option anymore. His doubts would linger, the shadows of his past always threatening to pull him under. But maybe, just maybe, protecting Margaret was his way out of the darkness. Even if he had to walk through hell to get there. Jack and Margaret had reached the end of the line. The shadows that had been closing in on them were now right on their heels. The motel room was dark, the only light coming from a dim bulb hanging above the table where they sat, a map of the town spread out between them. Jack traced his finger over the layout, pointing to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts. That was where it would happen. It was the perfect place for a final stand. Isolated, quiet, and just out of sight from prying eyes. They both knew the criminals would come soon. The men who had been tracking them weren't amateurs. They had been methodically closing the distance with every passing day, and now there was nowhere left to run. Jack had been preparing for this moment in his mind, every move calculated, every step planned. The trap they were setting wasn't about running anymore. It was about survival, and it was time to stop being hunted and take control of the game. Margaret, calm and composed, helped Jack set the pieces in place. Despite everything, she had earned his respect. He had seen glimpses of her past in the way she handled herself. The uncertainty he had felt about her had lessened. She was tough, sharper than he had given her credit for, and had her own reasons for fighting as hard as she had. Now they were partners in this. Both of them had too much at stake to falter. They worked in silence, each knowing what had to be done without needing to say a word. The criminals were closing in faster than Jack anticipated. By the time they reached the warehouse, the sky was dark, and the air was thick with tension. The trap had been set. Jack had created a false trail to lure the men right where he wanted them. He stood hidden in the shadows, his eyes scanning the area for movement. Margaret took a position across the room, ready, calm, her body poised for the coming confrontation. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but his hands were steady. He hadn't had to use the skills he had learned from his old life in a long time, but muscle memory took over. The men entered the warehouse cautiously, their silhouettes just visible in the dim light. Jack recognized one of them, Richter, the man who had led the criminal organization Jack had once been a part of. He hadn't changed much, still wearing that same calculating, ruthless expression. The tension snapped. The men spread out, moving carefully, weapons ready. Jack moved silently through the shadows, his every step precise. Margaret, too, slipped into the darkness, surprising Jack with how effortlessly she blended into the environment. The criminals were skilled, but Jack and Margaret had the advantage of knowing the layout. Jack's past instincts took over as he swiftly disabled the first man, his movements quick and decisive. Margaret handled herself just as well, taking down another without hesitation. Richter was the last one standing, and Jack faced him head-on. Their eyes met, and Jack saw the recognition in Richter's face. They were both products of the same world, both survivors of something brutal and unforgiving. The fight between them was swift, brutal, and filled with years of unresolved tension. But Jack had something Richter didn't. He had walked away from that life and wasn't looking back. And in the end, that gave him the upper hand. The confrontation ended as quickly as it had started. Richter and his men lay defeated, their threat finally neutralized. Jack stood over them, breathing heavily, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Margaret emerged from the shadows, bruised but unbroken, and they shared a brief moment of victory. It was over, or at least they thought it was. As they caught their breath, the sound of a slow clap echoed through the warehouse. Jack turned, his body tense, as a figure emerged from the doorway. It wasn't one of Richter's men. This was someone else, someone they hadn't expected. The man who appeared was dressed in a plain suit, his face calm and unreadable. Jack recognized him instantly as a government agent, though he didn't know from where or why. The agent's eyes swept over the scene, taking in the bodies on the floor, the signs of struggle, and the two people standing in the aftermath. "Well done," the agent said, his voice steady and composed. "But I'm afraid this isn't the end of the road for you." Jack felt a cold dread creep into his chest. He had known there were other forces at play, but seeing the agent here, now, made it all too real. Margaret's eyes narrowed, her body stiffening as she instinctively took a step back. The agent's presence changed everything. The danger hadn't disappeared, it had just taken a new form. "You thought taking out Richter would solve your problems," the agent continued, stepping closer. "But the truth is, Margaret here has information that certain people in high places would prefer to keep buried." Jack felt the weight of the agent's words. The government was involved, and not in the way he had hoped. Margaret's past wasn't just about criminals, it was about secrets that went far deeper than either of them had realized. The agent wasn't here to help them. He was here to ensure that Margaret and everything she knew disappeared. Jack's mind raced as the agent laid out their options, though it was clear the choice had already been made. Margaret was a liability, and the agent had orders to bring her in, dead or alive. The room felt colder, the triumph of their victory evaporating in the face of this new threat. The agent gave Jack a hard look, his expression unyielding. "You can walk away from this, Jack," the agent said, his tone almost sympathetic. "Hand her over, and you can go back to your quiet life. Or you can choose to protect her, but you know what that means." Jack knew exactly what it meant. If he stood by Margaret, he'd be putting himself in the crosshairs of not just criminals, but the government. They'd be hunted, no matter where they went, never able to truly escape. Turning her over would mean his life could go back to what it was. He could walk away, free from the burden of her secrets, and the danger they brought. But could he really live with himself if he did that? The choice tore at him. Margaret stood silently, waiting for his decision. She didn't plead or try to sway him. She had known from the start that this moment might come, and now she stood, ready to face whatever fate Jack chose for her. In that moment, everything became clear to Jack. He wasn't just running from his past anymore, he was fighting for who he wanted to be. And he couldn't walk away. Not this time. Jack stepped forward, placing himself between Margaret and the agent, his jaw set, eyes hard. "She's not going anywhere," Jack said, his voice firm, filled with the resolve of a man who had made his choice. The agent's expression darkened, but Jack didn't waver. He knew what was coming, and he was ready for it. Protecting Margaret was more than just about survival now. It was about doing the right thing, even if it cost him everything. And in that moment, Jack found the redemption he had been searching for all along. Jack and Margaret sat in the aftermath of the confrontation. The once quiet warehouse now bore the marks of a battle neither of them had anticipated lasting this long. Richter and his men were gone, but their presence still lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the world they had tried to escape. Jack wiped the blood from his hands, his body aching from the fight, but his mind clear. The weight he had been carrying for years had shifted, not entirely lifted, but lighter somehow. He glanced at Margaret, who stood a few feet away, calm and composed as always, though there was a weariness in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. There was no going back now. They both understood that. The criminals who had pursued them were finished, but the danger wasn't gone. Jack knew that more would come, if not from the criminal underworld then from the government agent who had quietly vanished into the night after realizing Jack wouldn't hand Margaret over. The agent had left a warning hanging in the air, one that neither of them could forget. Margaret was a marked woman, and by standing beside her, Jack had made himself one too. The days following the confrontation were filled with a tense kind of quiet. They moved carefully, keeping a low profile as they tried to assess their next steps. Jack handled the details, making sure there was no trace left of their encounter, ensuring that no one would follow them from the scene. He was methodical, careful in a way that came from years of living with the knowledge that one mistake could bring everything crashing down. Margaret, on the other hand, remained practical, but Jack could see the toll the last few weeks had taken on her. She didn't show it outright, but there was a heaviness to her movements, a quiet resignation that spoke volumes. Despite everything, Jack felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. It wasn't a complete peace, but there was a sense of closure he hadn't expected. He had confronted the demons of his past, faced the very people who had once had control over his life, and come out on the other side. There was no running anymore, no hiding in the shadows. He had made his choice, and in doing so, he had found a part of himself he thought had been lost. The man who had walked away from the criminal life so long ago had finally found a reason to fight, and it had nothing to do with survival. It had everything to do with redemption. As Jack reflected on the choices he had made, he realized that his journey had never been about escaping his past. It had always been about confronting it, about finding a way to make peace with the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. Margaret had been the catalyst for that change. She had forced him to look at himself in a way he hadn't for years, and in doing so, she had given him something he hadn't even known he was searching for: a chance to do something right. Margaret, too, was on the cusp of a new beginning. The woman who had spent years hiding from her own past was now ready to disappear once more, but this time with a purpose. Jack had helped her forge a new identity, one that would allow her to move freely without the constant fear of being hunted. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to give her a chance at some semblance of a normal life, something neither of them had believed was possible when they first crossed paths. In their final moments together, there was a quiet understanding between them. They didn't need to say much. The bond they had formed through their shared experience was enough. Margaret, in her usual calm manner, thanked Jack for everything, her words simple but filled with a depth of gratitude that he hadn't expected. Jack didn't respond immediately, instead offering her a small nod, knowing that words wouldn't capture the weight of what they had been through. As Margaret prepared to leave, slipping into the anonymity of her new life, Jack felt a pang of something close to regret. He knew he wouldn't see her again, not if everything went according to plan. But that was the nature of their world now. It was a world of ghosts, of people slipping through the cracks, always looking over their shoulders but never quite looking back. Margaret disappeared into the night, her figure fading into the shadows, but Jack knew she would be all right. She was stronger than she looked, and for the first time in a long while, she had a chance at a future, one not entirely shaped by fear. Jack, on the other hand, remained in the small town where everything had started. He returned to his life, but it wasn't the same anymore. The gas station that had once been his refuge now felt like a place of transition, a temporary stop rather than a permanent hiding place. Jack wasn't running anymore, but he wasn't staying put either. He had found a sense of redemption in protecting Margaret, but he knew that his story wasn't over. There were still questions unanswered, still parts of his past that needed reckoning. But for now, Jack was content with the quiet. He spent his days at the gas station, serving the same customers, watching the same cars pass through the sleepy town. The faces were familiar, the routine unchanged, but there was something different in Jack's eyes. The weight he had carried for years had shifted. He still had regrets, still had ghosts that lingered in the corners of his mind, but there was a sense of acceptance now. He had faced his past, and though it hadn't been easy, he had come out stronger for it. As the weeks turned into months, Jack found himself thinking of Margaret less and less. She had become a memory, a part of his journey but not its end. He knew she was out there somewhere, living her life in whatever way she could, and that was enough for him. Their paths had crossed for a reason, but now they were moving in different directions, each with a sense of purpose and clarity they hadn't had before. In the end, Jack had found what he hadn't even known he was searching for, a sense of redemption, not through revenge or escape, but through protecting someone who had needed him. And in doing so, he had finally made peace with himself. As the sun set over the small town, Jack stood outside the gas station, watching the horizon. The future was uncertain, as it always had been, but for the first time in a long time, Jack wasn't afraid of it. He had faced the shadows of his past, and now, whatever came next, he knew he could handle it.